Your four favorites are The Dangerous Lives of Altar Boys, Stand By Me, Boys in the Hood, and Lady Bird. There's so many connections I could make with these movies. They're all coming-of-age films. 3 of them are directorial debuts. I mean, Peter Kerr directed a concert film before The Dangerous Lives of Altar Boys, but that was his first narrative feature. Boys in the Hood was John Singleton's directorial debut. And Lady Bird wasn't Greta Gerwig's first time directing, but it was her solo directorial debut. I've recommended Boys in the Hood to people with Stand By Me in their favorites and vice versa, because both films involve a group of boys finding a dead body near some railroad tracks. And The Dangerous Lives of Altar Boys and Lady Bird both take place in Catholic schools, so there were a lot of movies that would have been perfect, but you saw pretty much all of them. The first movie that came to mind that you didn't have marked as watch was A Guide to Recognizing Your Saints. It's a coming-of-age film and a directorial debut. Like The Dangerous Lives of Altar Boys, the protagonist goes to Catholic school. Like Stand By Me, the movie follows an adult writer reflecting back on his childhood. Like Boys in the Hood, it depicts teenagers getting involved with drugs, crime, and violence. And like Lady Bird, the protagonist wants so badly to leave the area where he grew up. Except in Lady Bird, she wants to leave California for New York, and in this movie, the protagonist wants to leave New York for California. A Bronx Tale is another coming-of-age directorial debut, and it involves gangs and racism like Boys in the Hood. Heavenly Creatures is a coming-of-age film about teenage girls like Lady Bird, and the characters paint, write stories, and create their own fantasy world, which reminds me of how the characters in The Dangerous Lives of Altar Boys make their own comic books. The Diary of a Teenage Girl is a coming-of-age film with a female protagonist like Lady Bird, and like The Dangerous Lives of Altar Boys, it combines live action with animation, and the protagonist makes comics. Speaking of coming-of-age films involving comics, you might like Look Back and Funny Pages. Margaret is a coming-of-age film about a teenage girl who has a rocky relationship with her mother like Lady Bird, and like The Dangerous Lives of Altar Boys, Kieran Culkin is in it. American Animals came to mind when I was thinking of The Dangerous Lives of Altar Boys because it's about a group of college kids planning a heist, and I guess you could call at least one of the pranks from The Dangerous Lives of Altar Boys a heist, but both films involve youth, acts of rebellion, and art. Speaking of youth and rebellion, I think you should check out The Young and the Damned. You might like The 400 Blows, which was one of John Singleton's favorite films and had an influence on Boys in the Hood. I've recommended La Haine to people with Boys in the Hood in their favorites before and vice versa because they share a lot of similar themes. Over the Edge is another coming-of-age film that depicts teenagers rebelling against authority like The Dangerous Lives of Altar Boys. And I don't know if this was an intentional homage, but both this film and Boys in the Hood have a scene where someone is being taken away in handcuffs set to the song Ooh Child. Since a lot of your favorites involve coming-of-age friendships between boys, I think you should check out Mud and We the Animals. Running on Empty came to mind because it's a coming-of-age film starring River Phoenix, who was one of the stars of Stand By Me. Another coming-of-age film starring River Phoenix that you should check out is Dogfight. And this is a stretch, but it reminds me of Lady Bird because it takes place in San Francisco, which is only a couple hours away from Sacramento, where Lady Bird takes place, and the protagonist's last name is Birdlace, which makes me think of Lady Bird. Speaking of movies with dog in the title, Ghost Dog: The Way of the Samurai came to mind when I was thinking of Boys in the Hood. Deep Cover, like Boys in the Hood, is a crime film from the early 90s with an incredible Lawrence Fishburne performance. I was surprised you didn't have Little Women marked as watch, since like Lady Bird, it was directed by Greta Gerwig, stars Saoirse Ronan, and Tracy Letts and Timothée Chalamet are in this one too. Speaking of women, 20th Century Women also came to mind because it's a coming-of-age film and Greta Gerwig is in it. Since you already saw so many of the coming-of-age films I wanted to recommend, I overcompensated and tried to think of as many as possible that you didn't have marked as watch, so I'm going to rapid-fire list off 20 more. Brick, River's Edge, Out of the Blue, Charlie Bartlett, Easy A, The Chum Scrubber, Thumbsucker, The Florida Project, Spontaneous, Rebel Without a Cause, Smooth Talk, Rocket Science, Finding Forrester, As You Are, Skate Kitchen, The United States of Leland, The Whackness, Fish Tank, Pump Up the Volume, and The Last Picture Show.